You're in for a big treat here. And that is Dr. Dipesh Navsaria, a pediatrician working in the public interest with graduate degrees in public health, children's librarianship, physician assistant studies, and medicine. He brings a unique combination of interests and experience together. Dr. Navsaria is an associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. We're lucky to have him here in the weather. And is director of the MD MPH program there, as well as the medical director of the physician assistant program. Clinically, he has practiced primary care pediatrics with special interest in underserved populations. He is the founding medical director of Reach Out and Read, Wisconsin, and has extensive involvement with the American Academy of Pediatrics at the state and national levels. We are lucky to get him here and lucky to be able to learn more about early experiences that elevate everything, early brain and child development and the future of society. Dr. Navsaria.
Right. Good morning, folks. I will say it's a delight to be able to go outside in February and not have my face hurt from the cold. So thank you. There's another group that would always invite me to come in January to speak in Arizona, and I was like, oh, thank you so much. However, as we're fond of saying in the upper Midwest, the cold is good, the snow is good, it builds character in some way. I have no randomized controlled trials that would prove that. So again, thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you today. A lot of what I share with you, I would argue, are things that may not be new to you. And you probably have heard some of these things even at this very conference as well. I always think, though, that these concepts are so key and so important that hearing them in different ways and hearing how they resonate with different fields of study, different types of work, is really important. I don't know how many times I go to things where I'm hearing about things that I get up here and talk about, and someone explains it in a way that I'm like, oh, okay, I never thought about it that way, right? So I'm trying to knit together all of these different elements, and hopefully you walk away with at least a few nuggets that you can say, this is something I can use as I tell others about this work, or use it in my messaging, or things of that nature. So on our brief voyage together today, we're going to talk about the power of relationships. We're going to talk about solutions for the problems that often ail our societies through relationships, and then kind of wrap it up with the big picture. However, as you heard, yes, I do have a degree in children's librarianship. I did that in the middle of med school. That's a really long story as to how that happened. But I thought everyone, including grown-ups, deserve some story time. So I'm going to read a story out loud to you, and you'll see the pages appear here. This is The Dot by Peter Reynolds. I see a few nods of, oh yeah, I know that story. So good. And if you don't, you get to make a new story friend in this. Art class was over, but Vashti sat glued to her chair. Her paper was empty. Vashti's teacher leaned over the blank paper. A polar bear in a snowstorm, she said. Very funny. I just can't draw. Her teacher smiled. Just make a mark and see where it takes you. Vashti grabbed a marker and gave the paper a good, strong jab. There. Her teacher picked up the paper and studied it carefully. She pushed the paper toward Vashti and quietly said, now sign it. Vashti thought for a moment. Well, maybe I can't draw, but I can sign my name. The next week, when Vashti walked into art class, she was surprised to see what was hanging above her teacher's desk. It was the little dot she had drawn, her dot, all framed in swirly gold. I can make a better dot than that. She opened her never before used set of watercolors and set to work. Vashti painted and painted. A red dot, a purple dot, a yellow dot, a blue dot. The blue mixed with the yellow. She discovered that she could make a green dot. Vashti kept experimenting, lots of little dots in many colors. If I can make little dots, then I can make big dots too. Vashti splashed her colors with a bigger brush on bigger paper to make bigger dots. Vashti even made a dot by not painting a dot. At the school art show a few weeks later, Vashti's many dots made quite a splash. Vashti noticed a little boy gazing up at her. "You're a really great artist. I wish I could draw," he said. "I bet you can," said Vashti. "Me? Oh no, not me. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler." Vashti smiled. She handed the boy a blank sheet of paper. "Show me." The boy's pencil shook as he drew his line. Vashti stared at the boy's squiggle, and then she said, "Sign it." Thank you. I didn't write it, but thank you anyway. Thank you, I appreciate you. Yeah, audiobook version available in the lobby. Yep. So we'll come back. There's a reason I chose that story. We'll come back to it. But now let's talk a bit about relationships and what that means. So when I throw this word up there, many of you might say, yes, there's all these things about relationships and all. Some of you might say, oh, relationships, isn't that great? And you know what? There's also folks out there who sometimes go, oh gosh, relationships, this is going to be those warm and fuzzy, cutesy sorts of things. We need to recognize that there's a deep science behind this, and we need to learn how to talk to others about this science, and that we can measure these things and we can study these things in different ways. Now, over 10 years ago, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came out with a report on the science of early childhood development. And what they tried to do was take all the research that's out there, because one of the problems we have in science is that we generate a lot of studies, and you're looking at these studies and you're reading the abstract and you say, okay, is this something absolutely new and groundbreaking, or is this kind of something that's one-off and we should wait and see, right? It's hard to pick that out. So sometimes what we need are folks who really spend a lot of time thinking about this to distill it for us and to say, yes, these are the things you can count on. These are the things that we know to be true, and it's not going to change when the next study comes out. Because, like, are eggs good for us this week or not? I've lost track, right? Sometimes this is back and forth. What they tried to do was to take decades of what we know about child development and say, here's some principles that you can use to guide this. And even though this report's over a decade old, everything they said is still absolutely true and actually has been strengthened by what's out there. So one, they said we need to think about child development as a foundation for not just community, but also economic development. We're not used to talking about kids this way often in the child and family-facing worlds that we inhabit, right? We think that children should have strong, good, healthy development because it's an inherently good thing. And you know what? I agree with you. That's fine. But the other thing, though, is that when we talk about infrastructure development, we're often talking about bridges and highways and tunnels and airports and all those sorts of things, which are important. But we're not talking about brain infrastructure as being important to our economy and to our society. And we need to learn to include that in those conversations, because for some folks, that's a primary issue for them, and they want to hear that. So we need to think about how do we tell that story in that way alongside the things that we already tell. Number two, brains are built over time. Now, this is only 5 words, but gosh, there's a lot packed into the implications of those 5 words. Because for one thing, people may walk out of talks like this one and say, oh my goodness, first 1,000 days, if we don't get it right in the first 1,000 days, forget it. Okay, that's not correct, okay? There's always the opportunity for learning, for repair, for moving on, for all sorts of new things, new capabilities, right? All the way through adulthood. Is it a lot easier in the first years of life? Of course it is, right? Does it take less effort? Of course. But this doesn't mean that you give up. And sometimes, again, the fear is that when we hear this, when we give people this messaging about the first 1,000 days, et cetera, that people will say, well, we can't do anything about that teenager then. We can't do anything about that 6-year-old then, right? And we give up. We shouldn't be doing that. And nothing we say should imply that that happens. There's a second thing, however, from these simple 5 words, which is that we need to recognize that you can't just do the first 3 years of life or whatever and then say, great, we're done. We don't need to do anything else. We can stop investing, right? Older kids have learning needs. Adults have learning needs, right? Through the whole life course is learning needs. So we need to recognize that you can't just simply pour all your money into the first 3 years of life and then stop caring about what happens afterwards. We know, of course, there's a great efficiency when you get it right early on and then follow on that. But we can't just be stopping there and saying, okay, nothing else is needed. There's a three-legged stool for thinking about the developmental health trajectories of children. There's the stuff we looked at all the time in healthcare, right, and still do. These biological factors, these medical factors, they're important. That's why we have them up there. But then we recognize there were some other things out there, right, that socioeconomic environment matters. Right? And you may have heard the phrase that a child's zip code that they're born and brought up in is more determinative of their outcomes than their genetic code. And that is true. Environment matters deeply. It matters deeply. And what's around them and what affects their lives, yeah, that's out there. That is what will affect their life course. But, you know, there was something we were missing in all of this, and then we finally figured out what it was. Who's at home? Who's in their communities? Who's in their early childhood centers? And how are those folks interacting with that child day in and day out? Not just a broader socioeconomic environment, but again, these smaller attachment and relationship patterns. And then we said, aha, yes, that's the thing that we've not been looking at as much as we should. And if we don't address that, then we're incompletely addressing the whole picture. Now, the third point that they made was that the developing brain has all these unformed, not yet well-differentiated neurons. Now, the thing is, evolutionarily, this is something that I find fascinating to think about. Let's stop and think for a moment about barnyard animals, right? Cows and goats and whatever, right? They're born. What are they doing within like a couple of hours? Yeah, they're standing, they're walking, maybe they have those cute little wobbly legs, you know, but they're doing this. Okay, how long does it take a human baby to walk? Like a year. We're kind of useless in some ways, aren't we? Right? Yeah. So the reason for this, from an evolutionary perspective, right, is that if you let the human brain mature to the same place that it does for other animals, you have a really, really big problem. The head is too big. Head cannot be born. It's not going to make it out, right? Not good for the species. We would all die. We wouldn't be here, right? So the compromise, essentially, is to say, fine, let's let a baby brain be born with the basics that are necessary and let that all finish later, outside, right? So in a sense, you can almost think of that first year of life being kind of like a fourth trimester of pregnancy in brain terms. That brain is still differentiating. Now, there's two things that help determine how do those neurons connect to one another, right? There's the genes, the blueprints for all that, and then there's the experiences around. Now, we can't change genes so much. I'm not talking about epigenetics today and so on. But experiences we can change. We can mold that through the advice we give, through programs we set up, and through policies that we enact, right? That will change the environment around that child. So this is where we have a really, really key, important choice as wider society. Do we expose young children to experiences that push that brain towards wiring for safety, for security, for a scarcity mindset? Or do we push that brain towards wiring for love, for language, for literacy, and so on, right? That's up to us. That's up to us in the choices that we make. Now, again, you can't have one without the other. It's not all genes or all experiences or whatever. It's like a campfire, right? You need a spark and you need wood to get that fire be able to go on there. But again, we can modify experiences. And if you said, what's the key thing, right? What's the thing that we should be focusing about on? It's what we call that serve and return interaction, that back and forth that happens between young children and loving, responsive adults in their environment. And that's what drives us forward. This is really, really important in our messaging work because people don't necessarily recognize that what drives things forward are relationships with other human beings. That is what drives development forward. There is no toy, there is no YouTube video, there is no app that will do this in young children on its own. You need to have a caring adult next to them. As one of my colleagues once said, there is no app to replace your lap. T-shirts available in the lobby. No, yeah. So, right. But this is really important because parents are getting bombarded with messaging. Put your child in front of this toy. It's good for their brain. Have them watch these learning videos in the first year of life. It'll help them learn and get a head start. You know, expose them to this, implant this iPhone in utero. Well, we haven't gotten there yet, but you know, but there is a lot of this messaging, and parents are often sitting there wondering, okay, well, I should do this, right? I don't want my child to be behind. I don't want to disadvantage them in different ways. So when I was an undergrad, I worked for a research study run by Dr. Ed Tronick at Children's Hospital in Boston. Many of you are maybe familiar with it, the face-to-face paradigm that he developed. And I'm going to play an excerpt from this that you may have seen before. And let's watch what happens when these interactions happen well, what happens when they don't happen so well, and then the repair that happens when, again, it's short-term and they're able to come back here.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
So that video reflected what we typically expect to see, right? That we saw this back and forth, you know, baby was doing these escalating bids for attention, right? Like, gee, I pointed before and mom looked. Let me try that again. And this got more and more upset as, you know, the deal was no longer happening, right, here. You know, and then mom comes back and yay, big smiles, it's all okay, right? So what was interesting though was we didn't always see this when we were coding these tapes, that we'd see parents who would go into the still face and the baby didn't seem bothered by this, didn't seem troubled, didn't seem, you know, upset at all. Why? Because they weren't used to this face-to-face interaction, right? They didn't feel the loss of it because it wasn't something that routinely happened for them. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I don't believe for a moment that any of the parents in our studies, or anywhere, honestly, don't love their kids, don't want the best for them, right? Don't care about them. You know, no, not at all. There is no group out there on this planet that has cornered the market on loving their children better than any other group. Okay, let's just be clear on that. The thing is, we often think about this back and forth interactional behavior with young children as being natural, automatic, instinctual. Yeah, guess what? It's not. It's learned behavior. Okay, so where did we all learn it? How many of you took a credit granting course in peekaboo? Yeah. No one, right? So how did we know how to do peekaboo? Because someone else did it, and we watched that interaction. We said, oh, this seems to work. Let me try this. Let me modify it. Let me, repeat it, whatever, right? And it becomes self-reinforcing. So if you're not in places where you see people interacting with young children on a regular basis and you don't have the ability to pattern that behavior, what are you supposed to do? So here's the thing. We do a lot of great messaging out there everywhere in our society about talk, read, sing, play with your kids, right? We're hitting parents over the head with this. I have not run into a single parent in the last 15 years who has not heard this message. I mean, come on, there's gigantic billboards and ads on the bus and everything else. And a lot of people keep running up and saying, oh, yes, see, if only we did an education awareness campaign yet again for parents, then they do this. It's like, yeah, okay. Now, that's an information gap. We can fill an information gap. That's not actually that hard. There's a second gap that's bigger. It's a skills gap. You told me to talk to my child. What am I supposed to say to my 6-month-old? They can't talk back. How do I know I'm doing it right? And there's an even bigger gap. Maybe I'm the wrong person to be talking to my child. I messed up in school. I was never good at school. My child won't learn anything useful from me. Maybe I should put them in front of this DVD that's made by educators. It's better for them. I'm going to screw them up. There's a confidence gap too, right? So if we don't address the skills gap and the confidence gap alongside the information gap, then that information gap filling is probably not going to be as useful, right? And that's why I think a lot of things don't actually have great impact, is because they simply are just messaging, but we're not doing the intentional skill building, and we're not doing the modeling and the coaching that matters. Yes, that takes more work, but if you want it to actually happen, you need to do those sorts of things. Simple circuits and skills are needed to do more complicated things. Duh, right? But the thing is, people will say things out there like, I don't understand why we need to put so much money into early childhood education. Someone just needs to watch these kids play while their parents are working, right? I have heard statements like that from people who frankly don't have a clue about how any of that works. First of all, there's a lot else that goes into that. But second of all, if you just say, oh, they're just playing, play is not about amusement in children. That's part of it, right? But it's not solely about amusement. It is actually that child's job. And many, including T. Barry Dresden, have said this: play is the work of infancy. It is that child's job to be able to do these things because that's how you test out different developmental skills, different concepts, different ideas, et cetera. And if people don't understand that, then they're not going to understand why these investments actually matter. Now we'll talk for a bit about toxic stress, which again is not likely to be a new concept for anyone in this room, but still out there. It's not something that's necessarily as well known. I have the privilege of teaching undergraduates at UW-Madison in the School of Human Ecology, and for them, they haven't heard this phrase, they haven't heard this term, and once they understand it, they start to say, I'm finally beginning to see what one of the core issues is that's affecting all these populations that are struggling and having other issues and so on. So again, when this thing called toxic stress happens, it affects the developing brain, and it causes all sorts of issues, not just in mental health and behavior and all, but also in physical health. You may have seen this before. These are 2 head CT scans of 3-year-old kids. And I love showing this because it highlights, for people who've never read a CT scan before, they can see clearly there's a difference between these 2 brains, right? So this is looking at the head, cut here, looking up. Child on the left is a typically developing child. The child on the right underwent extreme emotional neglect. Okay, this is actually not physical neglect. They were fed and bathed and clothed. This was a child at an extraordinarily large, extremely understaffed orphanage in Romania, right? And you can see how simply not having adequate and significant interaction with others led to that brain being smaller, looking shrunken, not looking as dense, right? And again, lay people can see this easily and say, oh, okay, I see what you're saying there, and it makes it clear. And then that lets us talk about these different levels of stress response, because the other hazard in this work is when we talk about toxic stress, there are people who walk out of talks sometimes thinking, so children should never, ever, ever experience stress. Like, no. One, that's ridiculous. That's not possible. Number two, there's the concept of positive stress, right? That we need small amounts of stressors in order to learn, right? The example I always give is you have wonderful, excellent AV people here today, so the audio worked on my video and all that stuff, but I've given many talks where you get there and suddenly, ooh, there's no audio happening. Okay, rather than fall apart on stage, and go, oh my God, my talk isn't working, it's like, okay, you know what, it's not working. We're going to keep moving and I'm going to narrate that video for you. And I've done that. The first time it happened, was I panicking? Yes, I was. But, we got through it. Second time it happened, whatever, this has happened before, we're good, right? I learned a new skill and a new approach to deal with an unexpected situation. So, small stressor, heart rate, stress hormones, all that stuff, but it was fine, it was all good, and I came out of it with a new skill at the end. Remember that tolerable stress is more serious, but it's well buffered by supportive relationships. And the key thing is that toxic stress may be the same type of stressor, but it's prolonged. It doesn't go away so easily, and there's few or no protective relationships. So people often think like, oh my goodness, you were caught in like the earthquakes, right, in the Middle East, right? Oh my goodness, that's a toxic stressor. Well, yeah, it's big, it's major, it's big time. But how we recover from it and the network of protective relationships actually is the key determinant, not how bad the stressor necessarily was. So in a young child's life, when you have those situations where you don't have those relationships, right, these happen a lot. They're not just these big earthquakes, right? It's things like child abuse, parental substance abuse, homelessness. These affect brains in this way that we call toxic stress. And the feedback loop that I find works really well when explaining this to others is to say, think about this. When these stressors happen, you have a stress response. We all have a stress response built in, right? And that built-in stress response is a good one. If you're walking in the woods and a hungry bear shows up, right, you want to have a built-in stress response. You don't want to be looking saying, oh, I've never seen this animal before. I wonder if it will be my friend. No, it's going to eat you, right? So you have that built-in fight, flight, or freeze kind of effect. But what happens when you're hitting that red alert button in your brain over and over and over and over again? You're pumping out these stress hormones. It causes changes in brain architecture, but here's what we all see. We see it in our clinics. We see it in our classrooms. We see it in our juvenile detention centers. We see it in all sorts of places, right? That this child is not as calm. They can't cope as well, right? And that in turn feeds more stress because it causes all sorts of things in the environment and so on. And the example I often give is to think about 2 3-year-olds in the first day of preschool, okay? They get into story circle, teacher's reading aloud, and kid number 1 who, had a benign childhood, everything's fine, good supportive home, blah, 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 all that stuff. They do what 3-year-olds often do. They start talking to their friend next to them, okay? The teacher sees that, and the teacher gets a little frown on their face. Kid sees that. Kid sees that little frown and says, oopsie, when mom gets that frown on her face at home, that means I did something I shouldn't be doing, and they pipe right down. That entire interaction was so brief and so fleeting that no one is going to remember it even 2 minutes later, including the 2 people involved in it, because it's such a non-big deal. Kid number 2 grew up in a lot of chaos, maybe violence at home, yelling, screaming, whatever, all sorts of things. Same thing happens, talks to her friend, teacher gets the frown on her face, and that doesn't say, oopsie. No, in that kid's brain, uh-oh. Someone is going to start yelling at me. Someone's going to start throwing things. Someone is going to hit me. Red alert. Hit the red alert button. They freeze up. They dive under a table. They run down the hall to get away from what seems to be threat and danger. This is a survival strategy. It has kept this kid alive to the present day. It's worked on some level. But what do? We say, oh, what's wrong with that kid? Right? Wrong question. What happened to that kid? Right? It helps us start to then tease apart what are the questions we should be asking to be able to help them. This is a website that I have no connection with. It's called echoparenting.org, and I found this graphic on there that they allow people to use freely. It's not really a linear path in the same way that it implies, but I liked the questions on here because I think this is very helpful for people who are in child and family-facing situations to be able to start asking some basic questions about what's going on here when they see behavior that puzzles them. So you see that behavior, and first of all, right, is there some sort of basic human need in play here, right? Is this child hungry, for example, right? We all know hangry is a thing, right? Yeah. So is that what, or are they tired, right? We hope people are thinking about this with young children, but yeah, sometimes. Is it a developmental stage? Is anyone here surprised if I tell you that a 2-year-old yesterday was screaming and crying on the floor and like pounding their fists against the ground having a tantrum? No, because it's normal for 2-year-olds to do that. This happens, right? It's not unusual. It is unusual if, say, a member of Congress does it, right? But actually, maybe not, but anyway. Right? But it is not an appropriate developmental stage is what we'll say. Yeah, okay. Is it the current state of the nervous system? Did someone give this young child a caffeinated beverage, right? And they're acting out as a result, right? That happens. I still have this memory of being on an airplane once where some parent behind me gave their young child, let them have a caffeinated soda, and then the kid proceeded to kick my seat for the next 4 hours. I'm usually very tolerant of kids on airplanes, but I'm just like, parent, why? Why did you do that? So, is this that survival response that we talked about? Is it a coping strategy that no longer works? Something that worked really, really well when you're 5 and might have even been cute and forgivable probably doesn't look so great when you're 13, right? So what's going on there? Can there be structural changes in the brain, right? That's something that would require evaluation and diagnosis. Is this trauma-induced thinking or conditioning? And then I love the last question. How is this problem, because the whole reason you're thinking about this is because we perceive it as a problem, how is it a solution for that child? What is it gaining them on some level? I'm not saying it's necessarily a great long-term solution, but how does it do that? So it kind of helps us walk through all of those things. And I also like to highlight to folks that this is not something that adversity and all is not something that is purely associated with poverty. Let's remember that the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, people often, when they hear about it, they, oh yeah, the ACEs study, I know all about that. That's what happens to poor people. I'm like, no, look who was in the study. Like, let's remember, right? These were middle-class folks, mostly white, mostly college-educated, in their 50s at that point, split evenly between men and women. This is not your stereotypical impoverished at-risk population, right, that we like to go on about. Sure, the risks are higher. Sure, the number of ACEs are higher. But it's not that, this is something that's confined to just one small segment of society, because it's really easy to kind of do, that's a problem for those people over there, right? And we need to help those people, but everyone else is fine. I once was at a conference in California where we were talking about ACEs and all, and everyone in the room was people who did this work, and they'd handed out those audience response clickers, right? And those are completely anonymous, of course, in most circumstances. And they went through the 10 ACEs questions. I wouldn't have done this, but they did this. They went through the 10 ACEs questions with the people in the room and then put it up in aggregate, right? And the number of ACEs of professionals doing this work was actually eerily similar to what they saw in the ACEs study. And it was just like, oh, wow. Right? It sort of made it very personal and very close, and I imagine that would be the case in most situations. So the last point that they made, again, in that report was if we get it right, early on, it's more effective and less costly, right? We see great economic returns, $4 to $9 for every dollar invested in childhood programs. If you're not familiar with James Heckman's work, he's a Nobel laureate in economics, so he knows way more about this stuff than I do, and has made this his life's work. But long before we had, Nobel Prizes and CT scans and so on, let's remember Frederick Douglass also told us it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, right? So about 10 plus years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics released their landmark policy statement on toxic stress. And it was the first time that in pediatrics we had really articulated beautifully what was in all these concepts and tried to connect all the dots that are out there in different ways. Now, a new edition was released about a year and a half ago because the authors said, you know what? We got a key issue with that first one. The first one talked about toxic stress, and it said, that whole concept that we've talked about of toxic stress tells us what's missing. It tells us what's a problem, and it tells us what's wrong. Isn't this a delightfully medical approach, right? We are so deficit-oriented in healthcare. You need a diagnosis down for everything and so on, right? And instead said, we should be taking more of a strengths-based approach too, right? What should be there? And by the way, what's already there that's right and that's making a difference? This is not to say that toxic stress, talking about it as a problem, right? Because it defines that problem. And it tells us how so many of these issues, right? It tells us what the connection is between all these things in our shared biology that we all have as humans, but divergent experiences and opportunities, and how they connect with these intractable issues and problems that we see, right? Let's remember, talent is equally distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not, right? And that's really, really key to recognize. So what they said in this statement is relational health. How we study the health of relationships is the solution. That's the path forward. That wasn't really well articulated in the first one. And they said, how are the capacities of, yes, the individual, but also the family, and also the community, how do they support the development and maintenance of SSNRs that buffer adversity and build resilience across the life course? SSNR, wait, what's an SSNR? So SSNRs, not SSRIs, SSRIs are, Prozac and Zoloft and all that, they have their uses too. But they use this phrase so many times that they said, we're just gonna make an acronym because we're saying it over and over and over again, right? That this is safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And if somebody says, yeah, what does that really do? It allows a child to feel protected, connected, and competent. Now, this is not terribly new news in a sense, right? I don't want to stand up here and say, oh my goodness, look what we thought of in pediatrics, because people have been saying this for a really long time. So famed psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner, when he was asked once to summarize what does all of the research say out there about what children need, and he basically said, well, you need an adult who has an irrational emotional relationship with that child. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. And he said, that's what it came down to. Now, I hate trying to modify his words, but I'm going to make one little addition. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid and have the ability to show it. If you as the adult aren't getting your mental health addressed, getting your depression treated and all that stuff, right? It's going to be pretty hard. As much as you love that kid, you're going to be struggling against that headwind. Or other healthcare needs. Or if we don't pay you a living wage and you're not home at night when your kid is because you're working that second job so you can make rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can't miss, it's not just simply about a love deficit. No, it's also about, are you able to show it because of the circumstances around you in different ways? So I think we do need to be very careful about thinking about that in all those ways. So COVID certainly highlighted a lot of things for us. It highlighted how much families are challenged. I mean, I remember some of the wacky conversations I was having in March 2020 and April 2020 in Wisconsin when suddenly healthcare systems said, hey, wow, did anyone know that childcare is an issue for our workforce? Who knew? there's someone who I will certainly not repeat actually said on a call, well, our healthcare workers, they're worried about caring for their patients. Their kids will be fine. They'll figure it out somehow. And I'm just sitting here going, wow, you're looking for a great way for people to resign instantly, aren't you? Yeah. So there's many challenges. And again, the challenges were not just about, COVID itself and not just about the economic impacts, right? We've also faced a lot of other things. Certainly the much needed national conversations that have happened and continue to happen around racism and discrimination. Again, the American Academy of Pediatrics has an amazing policy statement articulating the evidence and what we should be thinking about and doing around racism and discrimination and how it affects children. This came out in 2019, by the way. This is pre-murder of George Floyd. Okay, this is not a response to that. This is work the Academy has been working on. And all of our policy statements, by the way, are really, really well written. They're relatively short. There is a word limit. And I think they're very practical. So even if you are not someone in the healthcare space, I think there's a lot that you can get out of these. And they're all freely available online. I do want to say a couple of things, though, about the word resilience, which I've mentioned a couple of times. I think this is an important word. I think building resilience and all is something we should be thinking about. I want us to be careful, though, that the word resilience also can create extraordinary challenges, and it can also have implications that we didn't necessarily intend. Because often what happens is we start talking about we need to build resilience in young kids or older kids or adults or whatever, right? This is that book about, kids need grit and determination to be able to succeed and so on. One of the problems with that, though, is that it runs the risk of centering the problem in the individual. If only you were resilient enough, you would be fine. Let's fill your resilience deficit. It has nothing to do with the fact that, the economy's lousy, or there's no opportunity where you are, or there's violence, or what? Yeah, no. That has nothing to do with it. If you were only more resilient, right? So we need to be really careful about that, because that often turns the conversation to how do we fix these poor, broken individuals, and it takes our eye off of how do we fix the systems problems that are huge and massive and are responsible for this. Because I'm always thinking, when people talk about resilience, I'm like, why are we accepting the existence of a society where a kid needs grit and resilience just to survive? Like, what's wrong with us? Oh, thank you. And I will also say, for many of us in the client-facing, child and family-facing fields, right, in healthcare, in social work, in early childhood education, and home visiting, and all the things, right, we're seeing this sort of language creep into that. Well, if only you folks did more resilience work, you would be fine. My favorite was an email I got from our medical director recently, who said, we know that it's been really hard to deal with many of the changes we're making. Here's a link to a set of 6 modules on how to deal with change and adapt. Yeah, I'm just like, yeah, okay, thank you very much. It wasn't the joke I've heard about the mandatory wellness modules, but it got awfully close. Okay, so let's think a bit about solutions. I have no one magic solution to offer you. Sadly, if I did, I would be shouting that from the rooftops. But let's think about principles of solutions, because I think sometimes as we're trying to build solutions, we think about specific solutions and we don't think about the things that go into them. So one, how do we build capabilities, right? The parent who says, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do when you tell me to talk to my child. Help, right? Okay, we can build that. We can model, we can coach that, and actually it's not that hard to do. We can do that in in a short burst of time, and so on. Let's build capacities. They might know what to do, and they just don't have a life that allows them to be able to do so. I would love to read to my child every night, but I work in the evenings because that's the only way I can make a living and, pay rent, whatever. Okay, what can we do to help you do the thing that you know you're supposed to do, you're probably good at doing, and you want to do, but you're not able to do because of this other factor, right? So let's do some capacity building as well. Put things in homes and communities, right? Let's not make people travel. just to get, some help or some advice or some services, go to where they're already going. Address root causes, have long-term effects, use a prevention mindset wherever possible. Of course, leverage those first 1,000 days wherever we can. Use evidence-guided approaches. You notice I didn't say evidence-based. So if you only want things that have an absolutely amazing, strict evidence base in the world of pediatrics and children, you're going to do the same 12 things over and over, okay? Use evidence to guide. It doesn't have to be the strictest evidence because that's how we build out our research and all, but we need to kind of also allow for innovation, allow for trying some new things and things like that. So I have run into funders who say, oh, we only do evidence, we only support evidence-based approaches. And I'm like, well, okay, good luck with that. You're going to do the same 12 things. And then our biggest issue, we need to figure out how to scale things. Okay? We got lots of stuff that works really, really well. Ooh, but we don't know how to scale it. Scaling it is really tricky because it's expensive, right? So I love home visiting programs, for example. Home visiting is great evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Even if we quintupled funding for home visiting, are we going to reach everyone that needs it? Nope, no we're not, right? Because the price tag is high. So we need to think about integration. We'll come to that. Because it's clear that families need support. We've known this for a long time, and one of the key things that we need to do is to figure out how do we support relational health, the health of these relationships. And mind you, we have excellent data. Several great studies I saw looked at children 10 years out from Hurricane Katrina. And guess what the single biggest factor was in terms of how they did? The ones who did really well, it turned out to not be related to where they fled to, what kind of housing support they got later, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are important, don't get me wrong. But it was, did the family stay together and support one another and maintain those social connections and ties? And think about what's happening, right, with refugees, with people seeking asylum, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, some of the terrible things our country has done around separating families on purpose, that gets right at the root thing that is a key factor in how those children are going to do over time. So relationships matter. They matter much, much more than you'd think. And this is embedded in a lot of our work. So this is from the Bright Futures Pocket Guide. Bright Futures is the manual, so to speak, of how to do our regular checkups in pediatrics. So this is on the 15-month page, and this is the summarized version of the Pocket Guide. I mean, you can see here, what are we asking folks to do? We're asking them to observe parent-child interaction. Like this is like 2 pages facing, right? So you can see how much space is given to looking at development, but looking at that interaction. And then in terms of anticipatory guidance, right, talking about what can you tell parents about how to improve relational health, right? This is all in there, and it's been in there a long time. And I would argue that if we're looking for ways to scaffold these conversations, for families to meaningfully spend time together, building relational health, I would argue one way to do that is, of course, through shared reading, because people understand the act of reading. It's not as free form as this, just talk to your child or just play with your child. It's a little bit more directed in that way, and it offers a lot of things. And I imagine your state, like every other state out there, is having people arguing about how to best do reading instruction and, this method and that method and whatever. And frankly, it makes my head spin because I can't actually understand what they're talking about half the time. But the point I often make is I'm less concerned about which reading instruction methodology you're using if children are entering your school system not actually familiar with the concept of books and being read to. Right? That actually might be a bigger concern that's out there. Because if you want children to be successful, fluent readers, you need them to start with having good, high-quality reading instruction and support, right? And what that may be, right, still working on. Also means no learning disabilities or making sure we appropriately identify and address them, of course. No physical impediments either, right? They need to have a good supply of books. But they also need to have adults that are comfortable and capable and confident at sharing books with young, squirmy kids. And this is really important to recognize, that merely throwing books at children is not going to work, because if you just dump books at them, don't know what to do with it, right? You need to make sure that they are sharing that book together with an adult, right? That it's just like I said about the videos and the apps and all those sorts of things. And of course, all this is much harder if families don't have their basic needs well met. And how do we affect that? Through programs, policies, and advice. I'm giving you this chain just to show you, right? Like if we're saying we want kids to read well, there's a lot of things that have to happen there, and some of this is rooted in early childhood and in what we do. Because of concepts like dialogic reading, for example, right? That young children do not sit still and to be read at, right? If you sit down with a 5-year-old who's familiar with being read to, they'll sit quietly and listen to the story. 18-month-old? Nope. Not so likely, right? And that's developmentally normal. But again, if you're that parent who's not confident in doing this, you're reading at your child, they're getting squirmy, and you say, oh, I don't think he likes it. Yeah, you know what? I don't like reading either. He's going to be just like me, isn't he? Right? And you see that little voice in the back of the parent head going, yeah, he's going to turn out just like you. So we need to do, again, coaching and modeling and connections to say, how do we make them successful at that? Do dialogic reading. Here, take the book, kid. You turn the pages. Let's talk about what's on the pictures. I don't care if you don't even read the text. I'm not going to make you write an essay on it, right? Right? And then the parent says, oh, okay, great. Now I understand what I'm supposed to do, right? Because reading to children is not, again, that automatic natural skill that we often assume it does. That adult may have their own literacy concerns, and that can actually go through generations as well, right? Because reading is hard, okay? It takes a lot of brain circuits. We're actually not hardwired to read. We're hardwired for spoken language, but we're not hardwired in the same way. We're pulling together all sorts of different circuits to make that work. But as my colleague Perry Klass says, when it works and works well, reading is a triumph of what the early brain is capable of doing. So unsurprisingly, as you heard, I'm the founding medical director of Reach Out and Read Wisconsin, and also currently the board chair of Reach Out and Read National. This is what we do in primary care visits to talk about shared reading. If I had to summarize it in a single graphic, this is what I often show people, the prescription to read. I actually have these printed. I actually give these out. And I'll tell you a little story. My original version of this was a little wrong. It said read books. And then about 8 years ago, I said, hold on, I'm getting it wrong. It's not read books, it's share books together, right? It's a relational message that needs to happen. So I changed it to do that. And, you know, and I also give these out at our door at Halloween. Yes, with candy, I'm not that mean. But we actually have some kids who we had one kid who asked for one year, and she's like, yeah, we show up every year for this. It's kind of a tradition. So I was like, oh, you know, so, yeah. So anyway, if you want to hear much more about children's books, shared reading, parenting, kind of all these different topics, yes, Reach Out and Read does have a podcast. I am the host. So if you're sick of listening to me after today, you don't want to subscribe. But if you want, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll give us 5 stars. And all. So to wrap things up with some big picture items that, again, come from the AAP statement, remembering that what happens in childhood does not stay in childhood. Right? And we need to recognize that. And when you don't have those SSNRs, those strong relationships, you get these toxic stress responses. And I haven't even talked today about how we're able to objectively measure these at molecular cellular levels, right? So if somebody says, well, is this all real? It's like, sure, if I need to haul out a bunch of DNA assays and, you know, telomere length studies, fine, we can do that, right? So for people who need that sort of proof, we can do that, right? But we need to recognize that when you don't have those SSNRs, this is what happens. We also need to recognize that people are different in terms of how they respond to the world around them, right? So there were studies that articulated how some kids, if you put them in really fantastic supportive environments, do really great. And if you put them in terrible environments, they do really bad. And then there was another bunch of kids who you put them in really great environments and they did better, but not tons better. And if you put them in really bad environments, they did worse, but not tons worse. They were less affected by the environment around them. the terms they used for these kids was the first bunch was the orchid kids, right? You take care of an orchid and you water it and mist it and all that stuff carefully and you get a beautiful flower and the scent and all that stuff. And if you don't get it right, it dies, right? And the other kids they called the dandelion children, right? That you take care of a dandelion, you get a lovely yellow flower. You ignore it and let it grow out of a crack in the sidewalk and step on it all the time, you get a yellow flower, right? And this is important because there's always someone who tells some story about, well, what about so-and-so who grew up in this war-torn blah, 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 and ended up being a world famous, it's always a neurosurgeon for some reason, right? Right. And you're just like, yeah. And for that story, I can probably pull out 2,000 more that you've never heard about because they didn't survive or they didn't make it or didn't accomplish anything or struggled through life as a result, right? So we need to recognize this. But even when this adversity exists, if you have this SSNRs, it increases the chances that you get those positive stress responses and you get those healthy future adaptations and not these cycles that we talked about earlier. And let's remember, this is a biological imperative, okay? It's like oxygen or food or water or all those sorts of things because kids need to be able to fulfill their potential. They need to be healthy and, yes, I use the word resilient, but that's what has to happen. To be successful in all the ways that we can define success and to be the next generation of caregivers who build SSNRs, right? Let's remember that this is something that pays itself forward over and over. And again, I want to highlight it's not that only some kids deserve this or only the right groups of kids that are supposed to have this or whatever. This is all kids, every single time, 100%. And we need to keep that in mind because sometimes people need to be reminded of that. And again, from that report, they pointed out if you're going to look at 3 big prevention principles, support those nurturing relationships. Yes, look at systems and environment, reduce those external sources of stress on families, and strengthen core life skills wherever possible. Because here's the thing about this work. I told you that we weren't the first to think about it in healthcare by any means, right? That this is a synthesis of work that's come from many different areas, including early childhood education, including home visiting, social work, et cetera, et cetera. I could probably put like 10 circles up there. But what has happened over the last few years is that we've seen all these circles looking for this point where they intersect, right? And being able to talk about toxic stress and relational health and about SSNRs and so on. And that point right there is really important and really critical. And this is a phenomenon when multiple fields come to the same conclusion independently and have their own bodies of research that say, yes, yes, this is the thing, and we all get there through different routes. This is something biologist E.O. Wilson called consilience. This is a jumping together of evidence, of thought, and direction. And when that happens, you can take this to the bank, right? You can say, yeah, we've got it right, because a whole bunch of us got to this in different ways, in different places, and understand what's happening. So why did I start by reading to you from the dot? Because, 1, it's a good story. But number 2, there's a relationship there. It's a fundamentally relational story. That the relationship between Vashti and her teacher was really important. And you notice how her teacher read her behavior. She didn't say, well, why are you yelling and screaming and being ornery or whatever, right? If your attitude doesn't improve, young lady, I will send you to the principal's office, right? That didn't happen, right? So, you know what? She's having a bad day. I can understand she's having a bad day. Let me see if I can get just a little bit out of her, and then let's go from there. And you know what? She celebrated that small accomplishment, and the rest came from Vashti, right? She opened the door, and Vashti was able to walk through it in that way. We don't know if it was intentional skill building, because we're not inside the teacher's head, but what else did that teacher do? She built a skill in Vashti, because what did she do? She turned around, she mentored someone else at the end, using the same technique, right? So it's the next generation piece there. That foundationally, you can look at that story and say, what is the health of the relationships we see in that story? And it's a simple story, and it's one that you can easily share with people. Finally, I'd like to think about a public health approach to developing healthy brains. This is from one of the authors of the Toxic Stress Policy Statement, Andy Garner. Kids are going to fall, so we need a net to catch them. Here's your first net. It's a big net. It's got big holes, but hey, it's going to catch a lot of those kids. This is your prevention net. Some of those kids still fall through those holes. You got a second net for them. It's a smaller net. It's got smaller holes. That is your screening, your targeted interventions. Still a few falling through. Here's your treatment net. Treatment net is very small. If all those kids at top made it down to the bottom, they are going to be falling off the edge. They're not even going to hit the net. So if you rely only on treatment, which our society is really great at, right? Let's pour money into treatment. Yeah, it's going to get overwhelmed easily. And in relational terms, you can think about this top net as being how do you promote relational health? The middle is how you identify and address issues. And the bottom is how you repair issues when they've already happened. Now, there's something key about this. You can ask yourself, the work I do, where does it sit on this conceptually? Am I in a middle net? Am I at a top net? Am I at the bottom, the treatment net? Maybe your organization or even your work encompasses more than one of these nets. The thing to recognize is that all of these levels are necessary and none on their own are sufficient. If you're somewhere on here, you need to ask yourself who's above me and who's below me, because you want those above people to keep you from getting overwhelmed, and you want those people below you to fix the things that you're like, okay, this is more than we can handle. We need each other. These are not your competitors. These are your friends and allies, so we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to make sure they're well funded? And often in what we sometimes term the nonprofit Hunger Games, right, where you're all fighting over this one limited pot of money, we should be asking, why isn't this pot bigger? Because all of us matter. We depend on each other, and that they're not your competitors. So we need to be thinking about that in all those ways. And then finally, I want to close with two images. This is an image from the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. I actually had the delight of seeing this in person a few years ago. There's a lot of images of the Madonna and Child reading, and my colleague Perry Klass, who I mentioned earlier, actually collects these. She didn't have this in her collection, so I was thrilled to send it to her. Like, she collects the images, not the actual paintings. Just to be clear, did you know that Perry Klass is an art collector? No, yeah. But what I loved about this, right, look at this image here. This could be any household kind of interaction. One, you can tell that Di Tito, who painted this, has actually seen what human children look like, right? He didn't draw some weird kind of old man looking type thing, right? But look at how this child is bearing weight. You can almost imagine that they were talking about what was in the book, and maybe mom asked a question and baby's pointing, right? They're doing this beautiful moment of what do we call in child development, of joint attention, right? They're both looking at the book. This is a fundamentally relational picture, and it's beautiful how it connects together in that way. And I would argue that I think Di Tito observed human life very well because he thought this was so important. He assigned it to the Virgin Mary and Child in choosing to paint this way, and even has two saints there, right, like just gazing upon this, right? He understood relational health, I think, in how he laid this together. And then the other image that I'll close with here is my wife reading to my son years ago. My son's now in college, so this is some time ago. But they're lost in this book together, and it reminds me that children are made readers in the laps of their parents, and that parents are their child's first and best teachers. And whatever we can do to help them see themselves that way, be comfortable in being in that role and confident in that role, ultimately that's where you'll see the payoff there. I am out of time, but I will be around during lunch if folks have questions that they'd like to ask. This is my public-facing social media and email. And with that, thank you so much for your attention and for having me here today. Thank you.